My name is John Elrod. It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Professor Emerson Scheidler. Professor Scheidler served on the faculty here at Iowa State from 1950 to 1971. When the Department of Philosophy was born in 1969, he became its first chairman and served in that capacity until he retired and moved to ski country in Boulder, Colorado, and, as I said, in 1971. While teaching here, Emerson, I don't know how he pulled it off, but he spent a good bit of time traveling around the world. In 1957 and 58, he spent a year studying theology and philosophy of religion at the University of Manchester in England. In the summer of 1964, he traveled to Taiwan to attend the Third Institute on Chinese Civilization. And in 1967 to 67-68, he traveled again to the Far East, visiting China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Emerson received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1948, concentrating in theology and philosophy of religion. And while here on the faculty, he authored one book in the philosophy of religion and numerous articles in the history and philosophy of religion. Since he's been in retirement, he's been talking with some psychologists at the University of Colorado who seem to have become very influential in his work as a theologian. Tonight we're going to hear how descriptive psychology makes a difference to at least one theologian, and we're going to hear this in a paper entitled Theologians Anonymous, or How to Kick the Truth Habit. Welcome back, Emerson.
Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be back. Campus looks about the same as it did when I left. There are a few more buildings. Students are the same age as they were. Not quite as scruffy as the students I'm used to seeing on the campus in Colorado and Boulder. Some of my friends look a few months older. I suppose I do myself, although I hadn't noticed it. But it's a great pleasure indeed to come back to Iowa State. I'm highly honored by your presence here this evening. I'm quite flattered that so many of you would be interested in anything I might have to say, that you would come to hear a paper under the title that I have suggested. An alternative title might have been How My Mind Has Changed During the Last 10 Years, but I was sure nobody was interested in that. So I left that off, although in a real sense, what I'm going to present is some indication of where I am now. And those of you who remember where I was 10 years ago may see some difference in geographical location here. What I propose to do in the paper that I'm going to present, to reduce the whole thing to one sentence, and it really can be so reduced. Maybe I give you the sentence, then we'll all go have a drink. Sentence is this. What I'm going to suggest is that theology, ordinarily taken to be a set of truth claims, translates without remainder into the activity of making promises. And I've chosen as a kind of epigraph for what I have to say a sentence from Hannah Arendt. The remedy for unpredictability, for the chaotic uncertainty of the future, is contained in the faculty to make and keep promises. The theological landscape today burgeons with new theologies: hope, play, liberation, process, the oppressed, the blacks, women, not to mention the more long-standing theologies of liberalism, crisis, fundamentalism and its evangelical reincarnation, as well as echoes of the now thankfully passé death of God, to mention only some in the Protestant stream of Christianity. It would seem foolhardy even to appear to propose a new theology of promise, to replace and correct all these former limited understandings of what Christianity is all about. However, the recommendation to see theology as promise does not offer another body of content or a unique perspective to supplement or replace these other bodies of content for Christian theology. So the first question is not what promises comprise the content of theology. And I begin with this negative note, this warning note, because the whole task of theology, particularly within the Christian tradition, has been construed as proclaiming the truth by which we are to live. And the statement in the fourth gospel, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free," stands for most people as the definitive declaration that theology proclaims the content that frees the hearer who receives it in faith from sin and the destruction of death. And this understanding of the theological task expresses and responds to a prevalent mood that we continually confront in an entirely secular form. Our standard response to any question is that we need more research. What we want is a secure knowledge foundation to sustain and justify, if not determine, the decisions that we must make. In the popular mind, at least, if not for some scientists, the methodologies and assumptions of the scientific enterprise offer whatever hope there is of obtaining this foundational knowledge in dealing with the natural world. Historically, in a still more general sense, theology and its secular blood brother metaphysics have promised this foundation. Now, both theology and metaphysics fall into the same difficulties when they offer or are expected to provide the foundational truths that we need for effective choices and actions. One difficulty is especially obvious in theology. This is the question of authority, more specifically the question, how do you know that what you claim to be true is the truth? And the current debate over theological methodology, for those of you who occasionally dip into the theological journals, exhibits this problem without solving it. Unfortunately, the situation is circular. The presence of a recognized authority would remove the occasion for debate. The absence of any commonly accepted method or authority makes the problem of finding one insoluble. And however interesting the debate may be as an intellectual exercise, it is nugatory, and the citing of authorities to support various theological claims gains no purchase at all in that slippery field of debate. And a retreat to the more general field of metaphysics, which most theologians tend to take, is merely a retreat, not a move toward a solution. And the most cursory survey of the history of theology shows that in successive periods, the dominant patterns of metaphysical thinking have provided the pattern for Christian thought as well, and this is what we should expect. Christians live in the world and share its ways of thinking as well as its other technologies. And today, process metaphysics provides a stimulating and versatile vehicle for the statement of Christian claims. And it is objectionable primarily to those who require some more fundamental stuff or substance as the basis for reality. I think it is probably correct to say that in the current theological scene, process theology is the most active school of going theology. But every metaphysician from Thales to Tillich has proclaimed the self-evident truth of his own picture of what the underlying stuff of reality really is, which picture is obligatory as the basis for all further thought and action. The difficulty is that these differing claims cancel each other out, and we are left with the same problem as before. Now, this critique of metaphysics, which I spelled out in some detail last night for the philosophy department, is by no means the brash air and dictum that metaphysics is nonsense, at best merely emotive language. On the contrary, a given metaphysical system may be true, and none of them is nonsense. The problem is that we have no way of knowing which one is true, and this statement is not itself the truth about metaphysics, or even a truth about metaphysics. It merely restates, in easily misunderstood language, the obvious fact that my own personal preference for process metaphysics demonstrates my own perspicuity for those likewise converted to process metaphysics, and confirms the unconverted in their very strong suspicion that I am incompetent to recognize the obvious truth of their system when they point it out to me. Now, so far I've not said that it is a mistake to regard theology as a body of truth claims, or that it is a mistake for theologians to make truth claims. I've been saying instead that this approach to theology and the theological enterprise leads to an insoluble difficulty, namely, the impossibility of satisfying the demonstration demand. In a covert way, we've long recognized this to be the case and have taken a relativistic turn by urging a confessional stance to replace the apparent arrogance of insisting upon having the truth. In this move, I believe replaces I know. This sounds more ironic, and it sounds more gracious, because it does not directly accuse the opponent of error or ignorance. But it solves no problems for two related reasons. One is that the statements following the I believe are still put forward as truth claims, only now we have removed them from the necessity of demonstration by offering them as our beliefs rather than as assertions of truth. The other difficulty is that by putting them forward as beliefs, we have retreated to a relativistic isolation of our own truth claims. Other people are entitled to their beliefs, and each of us is left within the small circle of his own affirmations. And these affirmations which I make have no necessary links with the affirmations that other people make, and so the confessional stance degenerates into a privatistic relativism that says that each person has his own truth. And congruence between these is only a fortunate coincidence. The difficulty is not in the confessional stance. It is in its truth claim character, and this is not relieved by making it tentative rather than clearly assertive. The confessional stance, however, expresses another quality which is central to our purpose. A confession is an act of a person. It is not a substantive statement first to be dealt with as a body of content. We should first attend to the person's action. And this brings us to the proposal that we construe the theological enterprise under the rubric of promise. Promise is an action, not a content, although something is promised. The action character of promising means that this approach to theology is not to be taken as coordinate with theologies of hope and play or liberation or whatever, including, incidentally, process theology. Instead, to see theology as promise is just that, as making a promise. The paradigm is a promissory note that one signs as a commitment to repay on a certain date a specified sum of money borrowed for use in the meantime. While the signed note is a physical document that can be stored in a safety deposit box against the day it may be exhibited in court to prove the promise made, the emphasis is on the promise made, for without that, the piece of paper with the signature on it has no significance at all. Indeed, if the signer can show in court that although it does bear his signature, it was obtained under duress, therefore no promise was made, he would be free from the claim made on him. Now, while the creeds read like a recital of facts, truths that Christians affirm, I'm suggesting instead that they be taken as promises made, and that the Christian community is constituted by these mutual promises, past and present. And as a footnote here, while I am here speaking from within the Christian context, the same construction of the theological enterprise as promise would be equally applicable to any other religious tradition. It just happens that I'm more familiar with Christian illustrations, and so those are the ones I use. But this is not a peculiarly Christian position that I am here taking. Now, so far, this all seems familiar enough. We're all familiar with the commitment that one makes at baptism and is repeated at confirmation. But there seems to be some flavor here that the facts or truths that underlie the Christian commitment have somehow slipped away. And to this problem I'll return before we finish. What I am urging should be distinguished from the analysis offered by R.B. Braithwaite in a familiar essay, An Empiricist's View of the Nature of Religious Belief. He also emphasized that commitment, in this instance moral commitment, expressed in and sustained by certain stories as the content of religious belief. Braithwaite's analysis, while intriguing, has not been persuasive. It has not been persuasive because he claims to tell us the truth about religion. But his account does not ring true because few people recognize their own action in his suggestion. By suggesting that we construe theology as promising, I am not, as Braithwaite did, offering a truth-content analysis of what theology really is. In this truth-content sense, I do not know what theology really is. And quite in contrast to my advice to construe it as promises made, it may in fact be something quite different from this. And I would be quite prepared to suggest that most of the people who do theology don't think they're promising. They think they're telling you the truth. Now, I offer that as a possibly true account of a certain state of affairs in theology. But my suggestion that theology be construed as promising is not put forward as a description of what theology really is. This is instead a suggestion about how you might do it. So rather than giving you the truth about theology from the Olympian perspective of omniscient and impartial neutral observer, I'm offering some advice about how to construe our activity so as to avoid some of the difficulties inherent in our customary way of interpreting what we are doing. The paradigm for my activity here in this paper is neither the scientist, behavioral perhaps, nor the philosopher, both of whom try to tell us the truth about things. The paradigm instead is the preacher, who is trying to get you to do something. And what I'm trying to get you to do, in verbal terms, is make a translation from I believe to I promise. Now, at first hearing, this translation sounds about as awkward as the Japanese bicycle manufacturer's English language assembly instructions. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, as the Apostles' Creed has it, sounds right enough. But to say instead, I promise God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, sounds at best odd. And verbally, it is an odd way to put the statement together. But the oddity of the locution may help to draw attention to what is intended in the shift from believe to promise, in which our usual understanding of believe conceals. It should be clear that both are actions, but as we ordinarily understand these words, quite different actions. While the word believe carries a commitment content, it is an observer's word, even when one uses it of himself. Rather than specifying an action, it identifies a state. To say, I believe, is not to perform a specific action. It is to describe the condition I am in. And it is a condition of uncertainty about the truth of what I put forward. We do not ordinarily say, I believe, in those situations where we can say with a degree of certainty, I know. Consequently, the I believe preface to the Creed is not first our act of commitment to these propositions. It is instead a statement about the degree of certainty with which we affirm the truth of these propositions. We hold them to be true, we are saying, but we are not able to say, I know for sure and I can prove that God created heaven and earth. The shift to I promise makes unmistakable the commitment character of our action. We are no longer describing something, least of all, our degree of certainty. We are instead declaring our allegiance, pledging ourselves to a course of action identified by the content of the promise. What we are promising is that we will act in certain ways, not that certain statements are true. The truth question drops out because in a promise, the real issue is not what is promised. This is the truth question in disguise, but whether the promiser will come through on what he has promised. The issue is fidelity, not fact or truth claims. From the other direction, the hearer's or reader's question is not whether these claims are true. That's the usual question we address to a theological statement, and then the interminable debate is on. The question instead is whether the promise made is one that the hearer also is himself willing to make. The question is one of allegiance, not truth. For the question really concerns one's own relationship to and participation in the way of life portrayed in the given theological statements. Well, given this reversal of our usual approach, why not then return to the familiar contrast between faith and knowledge, assigning the action and content to the realm of faith? My reply to this is that this move makes no advance. It merely runs parallel to the line of scrimmage. If faith is set in contrast to knowledge as some other kind of appropriation characteristic of religious, theological activity, then this realm is retired to the entirely private and internal operation of the person, where no public criteria of judgment are appropriate or applicable. The truth claim character of theology is affirmed. At the same time, theological statements are exempted because they are now grounded in faith from any tests of their truth. The faith move fails in its own terms because it accepts the legitimacy of the truth question while denying that it can be satisfactorily answered. Now, earlier I suggested that the promise paradigm for theology might seem to threaten the loss of the truth and fact content of Christian theology. The promise paradigm, rather than isolating theology as a peculiar kind of enterprise, can be extended to all truth claims. And here, I think, is the real significance of the relation between theology and metaphysics, and between theology and scientific knowledge. The traditional claim of metaphysics to give us the ultimate truth about the underlying nature of things can very well be translated as a promise of the following kind. If you take, for example, as basic explanatory principles that there are two ultimate substances, one material and the other spiritual, that is non-material, then a great many phenomena can be brought into comprehensible relationship with one another. As a single instance, the role of thoughts and emotions, attitudes and values, none of which is material in the usual sense, can now be recognized as essential in the recovery of a patient who suffers from measurable physiological lesions. So long as the patient is construed as merely a physiological mechanism, there's no place for such things as thoughts and emotions as part of the therapeutic process. And the recent great advantages in psychosomatic medicine, as well as the appearance of the term itself, testify both to the usefulness of this metaphysical dualism in dealing with human illness, and also to its belated entry into the thought processes of the medical profession. It is necessary, however, to keep the logical priorities clear. It is not the case that the truth of metaphysical dualism has finally been recognized in medical practice, nor is it the case that the presence of mental and physical phenomena with their ensuing interaction in an ill human being proves that metaphysical dualism is true. Instead, it is the case that the conception of an ultimate mind-body dualism can be usefully employed to make a kind of sense of a situation of human disease. And this is far from proving that the notion of two substances is true. It is the promise that if you think in a certain way about certain situations, you will be reminded of possibilities and questions, you will be becomes sensitive to nuances and interconnections that you would otherwise miss or dismiss as irrelevant. It is the promise that the concepts you begin with will give pattern and structure to the possibilities that the world presents. I don't expect to win any friends with the next paragraph, but I think it is a plausible extension of my thesis. Scientific facts, or truth claims, can, without distortion, be seen as promises of the same kind, and obviously so, because of the regularity with which reported results and procedures are repeated to determine whether the promise will be fulfilled. A scientific report can be seen as the promise that given certain equipment and procedures, the reported results will be obtained. And the enormous emphasis in the scientific community upon integrity confirms this point. A scientist who cooks his data, or worse, invents them, to make his claim is no better than the confidence man who swindles you out of your money by selling you stock in a non-existent gold mine. He makes promises he has no intention of keeping. Now, by assimilating scientific data, facts, truth to a promise paradigm, I'm not suggesting or promising that you can make anything happen that you want to. Actually, I'm promising you that you cannot. The scientific enterprise does not dissolve into an amorphous subjectivity with no hard data content. The data accumulated under this paradigm, or the data interpreted from within this paradigm, are as hard and dependable as they ever were. What is dissolved instead is a mistaken dichotomy between two kinds of claims. Those on the one side, which have only persons as their warrant, and therefore are presumed to be subjective and suspect by definition. And those on the other side, which are presumed to be objective because they are supplied by some neutral external world and have as their warrant their demonstrable existence in that world, independent of any person or his activity. If there are such facts, they cannot be part of our knowledge for the obvious and trivial logical reason that in order for something to be known, it must be known by some person. Worlds. And utopian literature has had a long and durable audience. But we have reliable ways of identifying such imaginary worlds, however persuasive and enticing they may seem, and we have reliable ways of distinguishing aberrations in our own and others' thought. Contrary to the assumption that this check lies in an impersonal external world of things, clearly separate from the activity and being of persons, as the customary dichotomy between subjective and objective would suggest, this check is instead an interpersonal one. The check operates within a community, and in the absence of a community, there is no check upon individual aberration. The check consists in comparing one person's appropriation with another's, and it appears in a familiar and non-trivial form whenever we ask another person, "Did you hear that noise?" If the answer is yes, we are reassured because we've been relieved of the fear that something entirely internal and idiosyncratic is going on within ourselves. And the ground of the reassurance is the reaffirmation of a common world shared by both of us. And the vehicle of the reaffirmation is a common conceptual structure by means of which we appropriate that world. In a loose sense, we say we speak the same language, but the concepts are logically prior to the vocabulary and basic to it, as we discover when we try to find the proper word to translate his language into our own. That common external world becomes accessible to us by means of the concept of a real world, the concept of a world external to ourselves whose phenomena we appropriate. And the fact that that concept is almost universally shared and is the basis for charges of subjectivity and solipsism whenever any point of view seems to deny it, makes it no less a concept in terms of which we order our experience and our understanding of ourselves. We appeal to this concept whenever we ask another whether he also saw or heard what we think we saw or heard. And without the concept of a real world, such a question would be senseless. Nevertheless, the confirmation we seek is in what the other says about his experience that we can relate to our own, rather than to some direct appropriation of that real world itself. The real world concept dissipates, I hope, the suspicion that the position I am here urging is a subjective idealism. It is not an idealism, despite the emphasis upon the logical priority of concepts, for the simple reason that to say that concepts are the vehicles by which we appropriate the real world says nothing about what that real world really is. Idealisms all say that the ultimate stuff of the world is mind or like mind in its nature. Here I'm not making any claim at all that the real world is mental or mind in nature, or even that we know what the ultimate stuff of the world is. And that is a metaphysical question to which we do not have to have an answer. And there are no clear indications that we need an answer in order to go about our business. And this view is not subjective because of the interpersonal communal character of the conceptual structure by means of which we participate in and appropriate whatever goes on. So both subjectivity and objectivity need to be redefined. Just as subjectivity cannot be equated with personal without making everything subjective, thus draining the term of any power to make any distinctions, so objectivity cannot be equated with external and impersonal as if the external world could be appropriated without any personal participation in the process. Objective means the possibility in principle, as well as in practice, of interpersonal check and confirmation of one's own responses and interpretations. Objectivity resides in the existence of an apparatus for interpersonal interaction, and a common conceptual structure provides this apparatus. And a common language provides this apparatus. And if we understand each other, it is because we are using words in approximately the same way. Subjectivity is the absence of or refusal to use such an interpersonal conceptual structure to relate one's own notions to those of others. Subjectivity is not personal. Everything that human beings do is personal in this sense. Subjectivity is privacy and isolation from the conceptual structure that is the vehicle of our interaction with a community of our peers. Now, there still remains at least a word about the content of the theological promises that we make. Theological work consists both in saying something, making promises traditionally prefaced by "I believe," and in explicating the content, the implications, the meaning of the promises made. And the significance of this promise paradigm might be made clearer by a few suggestions as to how the translation from the traditional truth claim paradigm would go. One shifts from the passive voice to the active, from assent to the probable truth of certain statements, to the declaration of the concepts central to one's understanding of himself and the world. The difference between the atheist and the theist, and specifically the Christian theist, is not in the fact that one denies certain truths the other affirms. The difference is in the concepts each uses to appropriate the possibilities the world offers. The person for whom God is a centrally important concept promises to live differently. Indeed, he promises to be a different kind of person than the person who finds this concept unnecessary, if not objectionable. The theological task is both to identify these concepts and to make their implications clear so that both the theologian and his audience within the community who share his promises and also those outside know what is being said. Now, what promises do Christians make? Because the classic creeds are shorthand statements of these promises, their meaning is unfortunately no longer transparently obvious. And many of the creedal statements have worn so smooth that they seem to have no connection with ordinary affairs at all. Take, for example, the initial statement in the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Two promises are contained here at least, one concerning God and another concerning his relation to the world as its creator. God is a name for that which is and is the source of ultimate significance. When we use the name God as a promise, we are not itemizing another object or being to add to our list of authentic things. Or as one friend of mine likes to put it, naming everything in the universe plus one, namely God. Instead, we recognize that we have come to the end of any series of justifications or explanations because we now confront or are confronted by the source, the ground of all justification or explanation. And our situation is that of Job, who finally could only say, I repent in dust and ashes. But notice, he was not repenting of any sin. The same point sustains the cosmological proof for God. While it is a commonplace today to say that the proofs for God are not proofs, the best arguments, and in my judgment, not very strong ones at that, the point is that those who use these arguments are depending upon the logic of a justification series. The significance, the meaning, even the existence of any given thing is established by referring it to something else, which in turn is referred to another, until at last the series must either wither away in some sort of infinite regress, or evaporate in subjectivity, or come to an end. And that end is at the boundary where a different move than another referral is required. We make that move when we name God as the source from which all things derive their meaning and significance. And this is a new move, because here, all explanations and justifications stop. Beyond God, there is no place else to go, as we realize when the child asks the ultimately unanswerable question, ah yes, but who made God? Now, a warning about my method here. I am not rehabilitating the cosmological proof for God. And I'm not offering a proof for God, nor even an argument to justify a claim for theism. And so, despite the superficial resemblance of my argument to Tillich's argument for the ground of being, I'm not, as he did, making a metaphysical claim. I'm not making an ontological statement. I am not even saying that if I am to make sense of myself and my world, there must be a God. That would be a disguised metaphysical claim again. I'm describing instead, displaying, if you will, the logic of a promise. The promise is that when I come to the boundary where a different move must be made, I will move to God as the ultimate source of significance rather than to any of the other alternatives. And there are other alternatives, else there would be only one religion, one language, one culture, one way of life. The move to God as the source and grounding of significance is not a knowledge claim. For this is not at all to say that I know there is such a ground, or that the activities, purposes, nature of this source of significance are transparently clear, obvious, or even dimly perceived. The qualities ascribed to God as a description of the kind of being he or she is, or they, specify the kind of significance and meaning we look for, whether the hairy thunderer, a galactic grandfather, a universal Santa Claus, cosmic muffin, or whatever. Now, by using personal pronouns, I have already suggested that the meaning Christians seek, that is, the only kind of meaning that will fully express the promise, requires actions and intentions appropriate only to persons. Persons, beings capable of intentional, deliberate action, are the highest category of being that we know. And we affirm this in our recognition that the logical progression in justification or explanation ends when, in response to the repeated query, "But why?" some person says, "This is who I am." We may not like the kind of person he is, but we recognize that there is no appeal to something beyond him. So it is when we say, "I believe in God." Beneath all declarations of reverence and awe that may be contained in the statement, there is the logical point that a person stands as the ground and source of significance and meaning. And in a trivial, usually unfortunate way, we have affirmed this logical point by saying it is God's will in the presence of mysterious and painful events that we cannot otherwise justify. Those who speak of God in less than personal terms, such as the source of or the power of good, will be satisfied with a meaning that stops short of full intentional action. And those who refuse to speak of God at all will be satisfied, perhaps, with a meaning that rests on the mechanics of masses in motion. Aside from the historical fact that the biblical tradition has emphasized personal conceptions of deity, sometimes to the point of gross anthropomorphism, there is a further logical force to the emphasis upon person as the character of the ultimate. A human being can be described in a variety of ways. as a responsible, purposing being, intending what he does, or as the captive of his socio-economic situation, so that he should not be held responsible for his action, or as an ill patient, the victim of physiological malfunction, or as a biochemical mechanism, or as a falling object, or a package of chemicals. None of these descriptions seems obviously perverse, because for certain purposes, each is appropriate. But only the first gives us what we want to call a person, and each of the others is in some degree a deletion from the person concept, derived by subtracting certain qualities of the person to leave a less than person residue. In other words, reductionism, to give the process a pejorative name, is logically comprehensible because we start with a full concept of the person and then successively abstract by reduction to less than fully personal qualities as those we wish to attend to. The reverse process, beginning with what is considered to be most universal and least differentiated, for example, although I'm not prepared to defend this if you prefer another illustration, for example, masses in motion, requires that at each successive step beyond this, something new emerges. Or else we must introduce new qualities that have no basis or source except our arbitrary choice. And this fact makes the process incoherent. Besides, this addition process fails the reflexive test because it ignores, by excluding, the person who is doing it. And why should we insist upon coherence? Because the thrust for coherence is one of the qualities of being a full person. And this is why we seek for reasons or explanations. And those who would use less than personal terms to describe God bear the burden of proof to show that their conception is an advance upon rather than a reduction of the person concept. Early Christians, and those of us today who still find it possible to recite the classic creeds or their modern derivatives, emphasize the personal character of God by calling him Father. And the term Father makes an important point, notwithstanding feminine liberation oversensitivity to its sexist flavor. And the point is not masculine superiority. The point is derivation, dependence, and the most intimate of all derivations, parenthood. On this ground, there is no intrinsic objection to calling God mother or parent. The point is that we are most intimately connected with the source of ultimate significance, so intimately that only the concept of parenthood will carry the freight. And it should be said that the fatherhood of God is not nearly so much a characteristic of God as it is a statement of the status we claim for ourselves. And since this is a promise, not a truth claim, it is an awesome promise indeed. Those who use less than personal terms about God, terms that exclude any relationship so intimate as parent-child, are making a promise far easier to live with than this one. We who would claim to be children of God are promising to be children of God. And Jesus must have meant something like this when he said, "If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." The promised character, in contrast to the truth claim character of the creedal affirmations, is equally, if not more obvious, in the second clause, maker of heaven and earth. All too many Christians have taken this to be a truth claim, giving us a fact about the origin of things that corrects and replaces such mistaken notions as evolution. And since on this view, it has at least as much claim to our attention as evolutionary notions, it, to my horror, deserves equal time in our public schools on the seemingly plausible ground that students should be exposed to all of the alternatives, for they should not be prejudiced by a practice that seems to say that science gives us the truth while religion is left in limbo. Now, quite aside from the gross misconstruction of scientific knowledge that this view expresses, it precipitates the truth question again in a particularly recalcitrant and distasteful way. When creation and any naturalistic account of origins are posed as alternative truth claims, there can be no satisfactory resolution. But the problem need not be so put, and creation as promise, rather than truth claim, is a move around this roadblock. Creation as promise restates the point that the meaning and significance of the natural order reside in God's intentions and activities, not in some less than personal process or worse, fortuitous accident. Creation is a significance statement about nature, not a causal explanation. And significance statements are promises, not entries in an engineering handbook, although in the strict sense, these can be taken as promises also. But as published in engineering handbooks, they lack all of the explanation that would make that character discernible without great effort. Significant statements about nature are statements of our relationship to, the responsibility we take for, the character of our interaction with the natural order. Now, while each of these can, in a perverse sort of way, be stated in a form that resembles a truth claim, for example, we as human beings are part of the environment, they are fairly obviously calls to action instead. A call to action is a request to make a promise and then keep it. When we as Christians declare God to be the creator of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible, we are promising as clearly as we can to accept a status as fellow members with the rest of nature in God's creative intention. That as persons, in relation to the other parts of the created order that are less than persons, we accept a peculiar responsibility for the character of our interaction with them because we are persons and they are not. By contrast, many Christians have asserted, promised, a superior status for human beings, a status that divorces us from the rest of creation. For example, that we have souls, other creatures do not. Therefore, we will go to heaven. The other creatures simply disappear into oblivion. My own response to that arrogant expectation is that if my dogs don't make it to heaven, I'm not terribly interested in going there myself. Heaven without dogs would be the other place instead. The creation statement in the Creed is a promise to accept responsibility, not a fact about origins. It does not tell us why things are the way we are. It is a promise to live with them in a certain way because we accept a status as fellow creatures with them. An elaboration of the other articles of the Creed takes the same form. Each is amenable to the promise paradigm, and much new light comes from seeing them in this way. But perhaps this is enough to suggest how it would go. In summary, two other questions remain. One is the question whether one must make this set of promises. The answer is, of course, no. And not even all who claim the name Christian would find it possible to agree on all the details of the promises they would make if they were spelled out according to this paradigm. Those who worship other gods or none obviously have made very different promises than those that I've suggested above. And this infinity of possible patterns expresses the inherent freedom of our responsibility as persons. For the world is not given to us prepackaged like a party tray from the delicatessen. The other question returns us to the beginning. Which of these promises that we could make should we make? In brief, which is true? Now, this question is not inappropriate, despite my having urged a promise paradigm rather than a truth claim paradigm for understanding theology. We have the concept of truth, and we will not abandon it, nor should we, even though we are aware of the difficulty of persuading those who reject our truth, not to mention our reluctance to accept theirs. Of this, two remarks. What we hold as true, we hold because of the promises we have made, not the other way around. The foundation of truth is not a fact given, but a responsibility exercised. The other remark is that what we hold, we must hold with humility and charity. The other person is also a responsible being whose promises and truths may be different from our own, so that he may have seen a possibility that we have missed. In this situation of differing and often contending insights, each must talk to the other to discover, as each makes the best case he can for his own position, how each can be corrected, supported, and sustained by what the other has found. When we as Christians promised to live as God's creation, we accepted a status of equality and participation with all the others of God's creation, including those who have exercised their responsibility to make promises different from our own. And our promise commits us to seek with them the way of life that will enable us to share our common world. Which pattern then is true? That is in God's hands, and it's not for us to claim more than we can know. Thank you.
Well, Emerson says he takes questions.